Hey, welcome everybody. Happy lunchtime on this beautiful Tuesday, February 13th. And we've got a great show on tap for you today. In a little bit, I'm gonna turn it over to my co-host, Corey. He's gonna be talking about oil filter housings, specifically for the Chrysler Pentastar engine platform here. This has been actually a hot topic, a lot of technician questions about why yours or what's different about this. Is it the same as the OE? Has there been any improvements? So Corey's actually gonna answer all those questions for you here today in our presentation. He's actually got a car here in the shop with us today, gonna give you some installation tips. I'm sure many of you have done this a lot of times and you can do it with your eyes closed at this point, but still, we've got a lot of feedback. Corey's literally talked to thousands of people about this topic in the last couple of weeks, so he'll share some tips he's picked up with it as well. But before I turn it over to him, I want to share the list of last year's winners. Remember we talked about those that registered and showed up for these sessions. We were putting them all in a drawing, and over the holidays we did a random drawing. I put all the names in. I took out all of our employees, all the headquarters employees, and we're down to a list of just technicians, put them in the random generator. And so we've got a list of people today that are gonna win an all-inclusive, all-paid trip to come here to our corporate training center in Irving, Texas, and we're gonna do a 2-day hands-on training session with them. And so our first winner is a Dallas local here. The name is Joel Compton. Next, we've got Roger Kell from Whitesboro, Texas. Zach Brookman from Crown Point, Indiana. We've got Pablo Asensio from Encinitas, California. We've got Luke Grieve from Wapakoneta, Ohio. There's some interesting names here, much like my own name, I guess. We've got Kevin Huff from Kennesaw, Georgia. We've got Carl Rudy from Oliva, Wisconsin. Dennis Jones from Deschler, Ohio. We've got Jamie Marsh from Grants Pass, Oregon. Stephen Dunn from Middle River, Maryland. And finally, Christopher Grabowski from Lackawanna, New York. We're gonna email all these people. We're gonna get a hold of them with all the details here in the next couple of weeks, but we look forward to seeing them all here in the studio. So again, congratulations to all of our great winners. And that being said, I'm gonna turn it over here to Corey now.
Hey, thanks Ryan, and once again, congratulations to all those winners out there. We're really looking forward to seeing you here at the training center very soon. So now on to today's topic, and I guess it's no surprise with all the props we have laying around here, we're going to be discussing the 3.6 liter Pentastar motors. Specifically though, the oil filter housings that are used in these motors and some of the things that we should look out for when a customer complaint is centered around oil leaks and oil consumption. Now, we even have a 2017 Challenger here in the shop, so that along the way here we can point out a few things that might be beneficial to you. So since 2011, both drivers and the technicians working on these oil filter housings have been plagued with oil leaks, inventory availability, and oftentimes comebacks related to these motors and the housings. And while it's not a conversation that most car owners want to have, the failure rate of these housings have been a topic around every shop and the technicians that have to work on them. In a way, they have been a gift for both the professional installer and the aftermarket. And I say that because of this. Since 2011, over 13 million of these motors have been produced, and along with that, over 13 million opportunities for repair, many of which have already been done, some unfortunately multiple times already. And it didn't help that for a long period of time, these housings were very hard to come by. And even when you could find one, the likelihood of the replacement unit having the same flaws as the original was very high, creating frustrations for both the vehicle owner and the technician that had to tear everything back down to once again diagnose where the leaks might be coming from. So our goal today is to review what these housings do, why they fail, and throw out some tips there that should help keep the repair from coming back to the shop maybe a few weeks or even months later. We don't want that to happen. So what do they do? Well, we know that they filter the oil because that's where the filter is located. But not only that, they are continuously cooling the oil as well through a heat exchanger mounted on the top of the housing. Now, these housings contain passages for both oil and coolant, and the passages are very close together. So even one failed seal can cause cross-contamination, severe leaks, and, well, really, even a lot of damage to the engine if it's not caught and addressed pretty quickly. Now, in addition to that, they have a specific, and they've been specifically designed to properly cool the oil under extreme conditions. So it's important that if you do have to use a replacement unit, it matches the heat dissipating characteristics of the original design, meaning that the housing should be made up of the same type of materials to ensure proper cooling. Now, making things even more difficult, especially with availability in mind, there are five different variations of the oil filter housing. So ensuring that you have the correct version is pretty important as well, not only for fitment's sake, but for the overall proper function of the housing. And that includes housing the correct oil filter as well as the correct temperature and oil pressure sensors that are installed on it. And unfortunately, both the dealer and much of the aftermarket are sending out universal versions that can put the burden on the technician to either kind of take a chance or use what is still considered good from the old housing and reattach it to the new one. In past years, this was, unfortunately, pretty much the only choice that technicians had. So what was so bad about the housing that caused so many failures to begin with? Well, we know it wasn't cooling because the original design actually accounted for that really well with the heat dissipating abilities of the materials used in the housing, as well as the use of the mounted heat exchanger. And so, in fact, not using an all-metal housing for these builds was purposely done in the original design to reduce the maximum amount of heat-retaining surface area, essentially meaning that the only portion of the housing that needs to allow for heat to rise is the exchanger itself. So why did it seem like going to a metal housing was a good idea? Well, the theory mainly stemmed from a myth that the housing was cracking due to heat, specifically and most often around the neck where the inner threads of the oil filter cap are down to the main body of the housing. Unfortunately, overheating was rarely, if ever, the real issue, and the culprit was more often than not over-tightening of the oil filter cap, which is very easy to do. The spec on this cap is 25 Newton meters, or we'll just call it 18.5 foot-pounds. And while it may seem a little silly to use a torque wrench on these, the reality is that without one, the likelihood of over-tightening is very high. And so chances are, if you ran across one of these cracks, it's very possible that a prior oil change was the cause. Now, along with over-tightening, another common area that was overlooked was the cap seal. These should be treated just like the seal attached to a spin-on oil filter. Lightly lubricating the seal prior to reinstalling it makes for a much easier removal when the next oil change comes due. If the seal is reinstalled dry, it pretty much creates a situation where far more force is required to get it to spin back off. And that alone places just as much stress on the housing as over-tightening it does. So force is the issue with cracking, not heat like we all thought in the early days of these oil filter housings. So what about the oil and the coolant leaks that seem to plague these housings? Well, it's another myth, and that is that the housing warps, once again due to heat, causing the oil to leak. But the fact is the high-strength, heat-resistant housing doesn't actually warp. There are simply some weak points in the original OE design allowing oil to find the path of least resistance and pass right on through. And when it comes to oil, that path is very easy to find, which I think we all know. The main issue when it comes to those leaks are that the oil can be found leaking in multiple places from the back or the front of the housing. And that's why the warping myth came about. It seemed to make sense that if both ends could leak, some deviation in the housing structure must be the reason why. But the actual reason and the fix was much simpler than that, like kind of one of those, oh yeah, that's a pretty good idea kind of things. And the issue all came down to proper sealing of the housing at multiple points. They were found at the plugs where the passages were formed, between the brass inserts and the sensors, and at the lower mating seals of the housing, and even sometimes a coolant leak between the heat exchanger and the housing itself. All of these leaks stemmed from one of two things. Either there was no seal where one should have been, or the seal that was present was weak and easily flattened or distorted over a very short period of time. So let's take a little closer look at these areas and what should have been done in the original design. Now, when our engineers first started looking into these leaks, they started at the core plugs, at the rear of the housing. Now, these plugs are a byproduct of manufacturing and simply fill in the hole once the build is complete. Now, these are the passages or the channels for the flow of coolant and oil. And when the housing is molded, temporary rods are part of the mold to keep the passages clear. But afterwards, it leaves a series of holes at the back of the housing. Now, post-manufacturing, the OE design calls for these core plugs to just be pressed in and ultrasonically welded, which in theory should be enough. But we're talking about oil here, and without a seal, there's no guarantees that it won't find a way out. In fact, we know that it will. So the fix was pretty simple. We know the gaskets and seals are the best line of defense for oil leaks. So simply adding seals on the core plugs before pressing them in and ultrasonically welding them onto the housing is going to create a much better and more proper seal that not only better secures the plug, but it also creates a time-tested barrier between the oil and the plastic of the housing. It seems simple, and really it is, but the vast majority of housings on the market today still don't address this. Now, with the core plugs addressed, they then looked to the front of the housing where the sensors are threaded in. And the housing includes both oil temperature sensor and oil pressure sensors. And the thought of the myth was that the oil was leaking or seeping between the threads of the sensor and the brass insert. But upon further investigation of the housing, it was discovered that the oil actually leaks between the brass insert and the housing, because once again, there's no seal. The brass insert is simply pressed into the housing, much like the core plugs in the rear. And so yet again, we have an easy access point for the oil to find a way around, and while the fitment of the brass insert was actually really snug, the lack of a seal made it very easy for leaks to occur. So the fix again for this area was just as simple as the core plugs. If we add seals, we're good to go. And with the addition of multiple seals being installed on the brass inserts, the housing is now properly sealed. By adding 2 seals installed on the knurled brass insert for the oil pressure sensor and 1 installed on the insert for the oil temperature sensor, the fitment of the insert once again creates that time-tested barrier between the housing and the inserts. Expanding on that, it was found that pre-installing the sensors in a controlled environment also ensures not only proper torque, but orientation. So, problem solved, but yet again, not implemented by most aftermarket suppliers. And if you're not sure if these seals were installed, it's a bit of a gamble, right, replacing the housing, because these seals, they're not visible. So it's a good practice to always ask questions around the manufacturing process to ensure that you're installing a quality, updated design. Now, after the core plugs and the brass inserts were addressed, engineers then looked at the mating of the oil filter housing and the engine. And as we can see, there are multiple seals in between the housing and the block. Now, over time, the weak OE seal material can become distorted or crushed and fail. And here's an example of what they should look like on a new housing. They're robust, but also malleable for torquing purposes during installation. And if we step over to the car we have here in the shop, we can see what these seals look like on an original unit after only 38,000 miles. Let me just work my way over to the car here. So here at the car, we can easily see that these seals have pretty much been flattened out over a short period of time. And it's because they were never treated with any type of heat and distortion synthetic materials. It's just a run-of-the-mill common rubber seal. And looking at the housing here, we can see we have 2 seals that are pretty well still intact, and they have a little bit of a lip before the mating surface of the housing to the engine, but it's very slight in comparison to what it should be. But then if we look at the rear and the front, these are just about flush with the mating surface of the housing. That's not going to create a very good seal between the oil filter housing itself and the engine. Let's go back to the bench. So there was another easy fix for this, and it can be found on updated housings like this one that now include the more robust and distortion-resistant seals. If you run across an older housing that looks like one that we saw at the car, it's a pretty safe bet that the oil leaks are coming from these seals if they're not already coming from the core plugs or the brass inserts. And then finally, our engineers found that much like the lower seals flattening, it is also possible for the oil to leak between the heat exchanger and the housing. And pretty much for the same reason, they were just not robust enough or tempered to handle the onslaught of the heat that they were subjected to. So pretty much simply changing these seals to the same materials that we used on the lower seals was again the fix. So now that we know what was wrong and should be corrected on the housings, let's go back to the car here and we're going to talk about some things that we can do to avoid a future comeback after an R&R is done. Even using an updated housing may not be enough to keep the car from making its way back to the shop if we don't address just a couple of easy things prior to the installation of the new housing. All right, so let's get back to the car here, and I guess the first thing we probably need to do is go ahead and get this oil filter housing out of the way. We're not going to be reusing that one anyway. And just starting out, one of the things that we definitely want to make sure we do, and you'll notice we've already done it here. So anytime one of these is going to be removed, obviously we have to remove the upper and lower portion of the intake to get to the oil filter housing itself. And when we do that, we absolutely need to cover up the intake ports here. Now, once you get the upper intake off and the lower intake off, you could do that before or after you pull the oil filter housing, but the recommendation is always going to be to try and do it before you get the oil filter housing out. You'll find that it may grab some of the tape on some of the little rims here. That's okay, just kind of push that down and out of the way, and you'll be able to pull the oil filter housing directly out of the valley, and that keeps us from having any oil or coolant that might spill from it going directly into the intake ports, or even worse, possibly one of the seals on the bottom side of the oil filter housing dropping down in there. That's going to cause us a whole lot of work that we really don't want to deal with. So again, always try to cover your ports as soon as you can possibly get to them before you pull anything else, giving you a little bit more confidence that nothing is falling down into those intake ports. And then one of the other aspects I want to bring up here that'll possibly help you out with an installation and keep you from having things coming back with a suspected new leak. With these, whenever you go to pull the oil filter housing, you also have to drain the coolant. And that's just going to make sure that we don't have spillage just dumping out of this coolant hose that's connected to the oil filter housing. The problem is, even with the draining of the coolant, there's going to be some kind of left into this hose here that if we just let it lay down is going to continue to spill out into the valley. We don't want that. We want to make sure that as much fluid as we can possibly keep from getting down the valley stays out. So if you have it undone, you'll notice back here, now this is on the Challenger, it may be a little different on some of the other models, but you can take that little lip of the hose clamp and just tuck it right here against the head, and it'll stay there pretty much throughout the entirety of the removal and the rest of the new oil filter housing installation. This doesn't seem to want to move at all, and as long as I don't tap it, it'll stay right where it is. But this again is going to keep you from having coolant spillage all through the valley. Just another thing to clean up, but also kind of detrimental if we end up getting some of that into some of these ports, especially if they're not covered. So go ahead and drain the coolant like it's suggested, but also tuck this out of the way. That way you don't have any further spillage when it wants to flop around. And then that's going to lead me into the next and arguably one of the most important things we need to take care of prior to reinstalling the new oil filter housing. And this is going to, again, reduce a lot of comebacks. We've got to clean this valley up. As you can see, there's oil down in there now. There's probably a little bit of coolant as well, just from removing the oil filter housing. But the oil that's in there is from the prior leak on this old oil filter housing. And as you can see, if I take my little hand down in here, that's pretty deep, right? That's a lot of oil standing in that valley. The problem is with these oil filter housings, oftentimes they will leak so much that it'll rise all the way past the point of the lip of the valley here, and that is what's going to have people thinking that there's a rear main seal leak, because it's going to flow past and then down onto the ground underneath the engine. So if we don't clean this up before we put the new oil filter housing in, we may have repaired the problem, we may have corrected all the concerns of the customer, but a week later they come back and say, hey, I've got oil again on my driveway. What happened with that part that you installed? Did you not do it right? Well, the reality is you did it right. The problem is if this was not cleaned up and it filled up high enough, it's going to eventually, with vibration, hard braking, hard acceleration, slosh back and then drop down onto the ground, and we're going to end up with more oil leaks on the driveway. In addition to that, too much oil, or any oil really, down in this valley is going to be surrounding our knock sensors here. Now, it may not impact the sensor itself too bad, but the pigtail eventually is going to have that oil seep into it, and it could cause a lot of issues with the pigtail connector on the knock sensors. So getting this oil out, and any fluid whatsoever out of here, is going to be the best course of action before reinstalling the new oil filter housing. That way we know if it does come back and there's new stains on the driveway, we might have a legitimate problem. But if we know it went out and this wasn't cleaned, there's a real good possibility we're going to have to tear all this back down just to verify that not only the oil filter housing is still good, but most likely we've allowed oil to stand in here and it's sloshing back and forth. So that's a real big thing to keep in mind when you're replacing one of these oil filter housings. And then one additional area I'll point out is our port right here at the very front of the motor, or I guess it would be the back of the housing. Some would consider it the front of the housing. Either way, this first port, let me get my oil filter housing back in here, where we connect right here is one of the most common places where a leak will happen after a new installation, and it's because this O-ring is not lightly lubricated, and it's more forced in versus going in easy like it should. So always make sure you lightly lubricate this seal, because in the process of pushing down on the housing and getting this into place, this seal is very susceptible to tearing or warping from being forced in. Make sure you get that little bit of seal taken care of with some light lubricant before installing it onto the vehicle. All right, well, let's make our way back to the bench here, and I'm noticing a few changes to my setup here. All right, well, as you can see, while we were talking about what to look out for, somebody actually ran off with my upper and lower intake assembly. I should have been watching for that, but I guess maybe they wanted to get it all put back together sooner than I would, and I am perfectly fine with that. But it actually brings up another good installation tip that I haven't covered yet, and that's the intake seals. Now here I have some of the originals that came off of this car, and some might argue that they can be reused, but that is definitely not the case with these. And rarely will you find any in better shape than what we have here. And as you can see, these seals are not only rolled in places, but flattened in others. And that's not going to create the kind of seal that we're going for. So it's always recommended that the intake seals be replaced at the same time to ensure that all gaps are covered, both oil and for the air. Now, along with these tips are multiple TSBs that are out there and around these oil filter housings that can be used as a reference for future issues. But one I thought was interesting was for 2014 model years, and I suppose it could be beneficial for any model where access is adequate, I guess, and that is if you suspect a leak from the housing before performing normal diagnostics, check oil pooling in the engine valley under the lower intake. This is a suggestion. This area may hold almost a quart of oil and not even show any signs of weeping, and it may be hard to visually inspect this area, which we already know. So using a long wooden dowel, insert it down into the engine valley and front next to the oil filter housing until that dowel bottoms out on the floor of the valley. Remove the dowel and then check and see if there's about 10 millimeters or let's just call it 0.40 inch of oil covering the tip of the dowel. If the oil is found to be pooling in this area, the oil filter housing may need to be replaced. And as always, check service information and TSBs for more diagnostic procedures, as there are more than a few for these motors and housings. And I just want to recap some of the installation tips we've discussed, because they can be the difference in a successful repair or an almost guaranteed comeback, or even a problem for a future technician working on a customer's vehicle. First, we can't stress enough the importance of properly tightening the oil filter cap. Remember that 18 foot-pounds is not a lot, and if it's over-tightened, it can create stress and ultimately cracks in the housing. And don't forget the seal. Just a little bit of lubrication goes a long way and ensures much easier removal of the cap on that next service interval. And remember that covering the intake ports should be the first thing you do once they are visible and they're exposed. Now, the book calls for 4 hours, but in many cases it can be done much faster. But even still, rushing through and missing this step can be catastrophic for the engine and create a lot of headaches. And of course, clean up before you wrap up. Standing oil in the valley is guaranteed to bring a customer back thinking that they have a new leak, when the reality is that some residual found its way out of the valley and onto the ground. So even if you can complete the teardown at a much faster pace, it's not ideal if we miss this one really crucial step. And then make sure you're lubricating the rear seal prior to installing the housing. It's usually easier to reattach the coolant hose prior to seating the housing in place, but that can also place a lot of stress on the seal when you're trying to make that transition into the port. And so as we wrap up here, we hope that some of this information, or maybe all of this information, is going to be very useful to you the next time you have one of these oil filter housings either come through your shop or you have a customer asking about it. But please don't forget, there's a lot of extra resources we have out there for you, just in case you may have questions about a part or an installation procedure. You can go to NAPAechlin.com, and from there you're going to find just a whole host of resources available to you. Whether it's a digital download for information on a specific type of part or a specific category, or you may just want to look up different parts and different cars in the e-catalog. There's no sign up required, there's no registration, no username. You just go to NAPAechlin.com and you can go straight to the catalog or straight to the digital resources. And the nice thing about the catalog is you can pretty much verify if there's a part in the NAPA Echlin line that you're looking for. All you have to do is put the year, make, model, and engine size in on the catalog portion of the site, and everything through NAPAechlin.com that's available is right there with pictures so you can verify the part that you're looking for. And in a lot of cases, if it's a sensor, or even on these oil filter housings where we have sensors attached to it, it'll even tell you the pigtail number that's going to be needed for that part in case you have issues with that connector as well. And don't forget to take a look for us on YouTube. All you have to look up is NAPA or NAPA Echlin, and you're going to find an entire channel dedicated to not only installation videos, but some really good quick tip videos that may be beneficial to you on a different vehicle that may be coming through the shop or a different customer complaint that you're dealing with. There's also the prior versions or the previous webinars like this that were done months ago. Once they're done, we'll put those up there as well, including this one, so that if you have questions again or you forgot something, you can always go back and watch that video just to be sure you get all the content that's available to you. All right, well, it looks like we have just a couple more minutes here, so I want to take a moment and just make sure we look at some of the questions that are coming through. I can't see them from all the way over here, but we've got my producer back here, Ryan, who's going to throw some out there to me. Ryan, do we have anything that the folks are asking about?
Yeah, we do, Corey. I've been answering a fair amount of them behind the scenes here, but a couple are worth, I think, asking in front of the whole audience. So one of them, and this was brought up actually 3 times, are the torque specs the same on each part number or each unit?
Okay, so that is a good question. And here's the thing, the torque specs are very important. You want to make sure you get those right. And I believe they are similar, but always, double check service information to make sure, because they are very low torque settings. You don't want to over tighten these things. So just make sure you check service information before, but they are very similar, I believe. What else we got?
And then somebody asked, just for clarification's sake, I think you already said this, but do yours come with all the bolts, gaskets, and the filter?
Yes, they absolutely do. So on the units that we have, it's going to come with new hardware. The bolts is going to come with new sensors. It actually also has a new oil filter, the correct OE style oil filter installed on it, the new heat exchanger or the cooler, and all of the new gaskets on the bottom side of the housing itself that mates up to the engine. So yeah, it's going to be a complete unit. It's literally just drop-in ready.
All right, perfect. This is an interesting question. It says, are there any reman units available?
That's a great question. To my knowledge, I have not seen any reman units. I mean, unless you account for the fact that there are housings you can buy where you can essentially just remove the heat exchanger and the sensors and things like that from the old unit and reattach it to those housings. But that's one of those, kind of gamble things. If we're replacing a housing that has 100,000 miles on it, do we want to put a 100,000 mile exchanger or 100,000 mile sensors back on it? So in a way, I guess you could call that reman, but at the same time, it's really just a rebuilt and kind of repurposed unit. So we don't do reman, and to my knowledge, we have no plans of doing anything reman. This is the way it works best, so we're going to stick with that.
Or in technician language, it's like hopping out of the shower and putting your dirty old socks and work uniform back on. Might as well
Exactly.
put some clean stuff back on.
Exactly.
Do it, right?
Yep.
And then I think this came from a name I recognize as somebody from one of the sales teams. It says, what are some common warranty or comebacks so far that your team has seen, if any?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question, and we spoke about this just a little while ago when we were on the vehicle, and that is one of the most common things is not lubricating this seal that plugs down into the port. Again, when you install this, it really is much easier if you install the coolant line first and then place it into the valley. The problem is that's going to give a little bit of pushback on the housing. So if you install that first, you have to be very easy guiding this down when you install it. And what's going to make that much easier to do is if you lubricate that seal. If this goes in dry, there's a really good chance it's either going to roll or maybe even tear when you're trying to put that in. So always make sure that you lubricate this seal. And then also the other big thing is over torquing. We talked about that a little bit, especially with the cap. Don't want to over torque the cap because that can crack the housing and it's just too much stress being put on there. So making sure we look at the correct torque specs on not only the cap but also the bolts for the housing. The last thing we want to do is, over torque something and mush these seals that are on the bottom side of the housing.
Mush, I think that's the technical term for that, right?
That is actually in service specs, specs and information. Mush is a now perfectly good automotive term.
Oh, perfect. It looks like we got some shout outs from this fan club here. It says, good to see the Echlin diesel man talking oil filter housings here. So
yeah, I have to be multifaceted. I've been cross-trained, so it works out really well.
Well, that's it.
All right. Well, I thank you very much, Ryan, for helping me out there with that. And folks, we really appreciate you being here. We hope to see you in the future sessions like this. And if there's ever any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to your local rep. We've got a wealth of knowledge and a whole bunch of people more than glad to reach out and help you out and hopefully resolve issues or get you some information that you might need. So with that, until next time, have a wonderful day. And once again, congratulations to those winners. We'll see you here soon.